Hello, everyone, and I'm excited to welcome Sal Khan, the CEO and founder of Khan Academy, to the Chronicle Festival. For those who don't know its work, the Khan Academy is a nonprofit with the mission of providing a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. And key to its mission is using technology in smart ways to support students and teachers. It sort of famously grew out of Sal's efforts to tutor his cousin in math over the internet way back in 2004. Sal has received accolades for his transformative work, and it has huge implications, I think, for higher education, especially as we talk about AI, which is why I asked him here to join us for the festival, and he graciously accepted. Sal, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So this year, you come out as something of, these are my words, something of an evangelist, it feels like, for the use of generative AI in education. As you wrote on the Khan Academy's blog not too long ago, we're at an inflection point in education. If we harness AI carefully and share its benefits equally across society, all students can benefit. So I want to start big picture here and ask you, what makes you an optimist when we're hearing so much concern about the possible misuse of AI and certainly all that world-ending warnings about its growth? So what makes you an optimist in this time right now, especially as it applies to education and AI?
Yeah, I think both intuitively, and there's tons of research over decades that the ideal education experience is one that can cater to around the needs of the student, whether you use words like personalization, words like mastery learning, which is just the notion that if a student hasn't mastered something, they should have the opportunity incentive to keep working on it. People have always intuitively, and there's research to back it, that lower student teacher ratios are good. And part of that is you get more attention, you get more personalization, you get more opportunities to fill in any gaps you might have. And so to a large degree, our goal at Khan Academy has been, how can you start to approximate some of those things, leveraging technology? And there's always been a dream, and science fiction authors have written about this for decades, that potentially one day you might have artificial intelligence that might be able to really even further approximate some of what a great human tutor would do. Now, I don't view that as a replacement for a great human tutor or a great teaching assistant or a great teacher. But if it can start to do more and more and more of that, then even if you have 30 students in a room or 300 students in a room, whatever the ratios are, you can start to deliver more and more of that personalization. And I think this inflection point with generative AI, especially, it's interesting that ChatGPT took everyone's attention, but I actually think the generation right after that, the GPT-4s of the world, and their ability to really take on personas and be more steerable, so to speak, are really promising in being able to make that personalized experience that much more accessible.
I want to dig in deeper in a few minutes into that personal AI tutor that you all have developed, and certainly how you kind of came to that point. But I just want to share some information with you for what we did. We did a survey of college administrators this summer, asking them, what they think of generative AI. And we had 69% of them said Gen AI will have a positive effect on teaching in the next 5 years. And at the same time, 60% predicted a negative effect on teaching in the next 5 years. So it feels like this moment where, yes, many of us see the opportunity, but yes, we also see this great threat as well, or great concern. I just wondered, from your perspective, what advice do you have for, say that faculty member who teaches, say, a first-year writing course and is just really worried as they start the fall semester that Gen AI will weaken the critical thinking among students or increase problems around academic integrity because they can't figure out whether, a student's essay is original or generated by a machine? What advice do you have for them as they deal with this sort of interesting time and potentially chaotic time as well?
Yeah, I think there's short-term solutions and then there's longer-term solutions. If I had no extra tools to use and I just had to deal with the reality as the world is today, I would do more in-class writing, or even try to schedule more time so that more writing happens in a proctored environment. I would also see if there's ways that, as opposed to just getting the student's final essay or term paper, that I can get more of the process of how they got there. A lot of the existing word processor applications, whether it's Word or Google Docs, they actually can surface kind of samples of what happened over the course of time.
Sure.
And I think if you just tell students, you have to give me access, the professor, access to that, that by itself makes it much harder to cheat. A student who goes to ChatGPT, asks it to write an essay, and then copies and pastes it into a Google Doc or into Word, they're not going to have that process there, and just the fact, and the students will know they don't have that, so that's going to make that a little bit harder to cheat. I think in the medium term, one of the things that we're working very deeply on, and we just made an announcement with Instructure, which is obviously a leading knowledge management system, especially for higher ed, is we want to productize a lot of what I just described, but productize it in a way where it's not just about mitigating the cheating, but it's also about supporting students better, giving the students earlier and more frequent feedback, and then also helping teachers and TAs get a first pass on things like grading, and then they can obviously refine it. So you can imagine, so right now I would say do more in-class work and ask students for a little bit more of an audit trail. In a year, I think you're going to have tools. We're going to be providing tools like this that are going to be integrated with knowledge management systems, learning management systems, where a professor can create an assignment, including the rubric with the AI, assign it through the learning management system, and then the student, depending on how much support that the professor feels comfortable the student having, the AI, Khanmigo in this case, could say, hey, let's work on a thesis statement. What do you believe? What do you not believe? Let's see if you can back it up. All right, now what data points? All right, your logical argument isn't that strong there. You need to have a more credible data source for this part over there. And then when Khanmigo reports back to the professor, says, okay, based on the rubric, this is where I would assess the student on a first pass. You should double check that, professor. But also, I feel confident that this was the student's work. We've spent a total 5 hours together. This was the process by which we got here. And for another student, hey, this essay just showed up somehow. I think we have to double check on where they got this from.
So you mentioned Khanmigo there, which is the personal AI tutor that you all have developed. Can you talk a little bit about its background, since you did work with OpenAI and they gave a little bit of a preview on ChatGPT and such? Can you just talk about its development and where you see it going? And you mentioned some applications already for higher education, but just want to give folks a little bit of context to what Khanmigo is and how you're using it now.
Yeah, it was almost exactly a year ago, summer of 2022, that OpenAI reached out to us. They said they were working on their newest model. I was intrigued from a tech point of view. I didn't actually think it was going to be good enough for anything that we would want to use. I had been tracking GPT-2 and GPT-3, which could write eerily good papers or essays until you saw what it was writing, and sometimes it didn't make any sense. When we saw, and I think the Khan Academy team was among some of the first folks in the world who had access to GPT-4. It didn't launch until March of 2023. So this was 9 months before that. This was 3 months before ChatGPT came out. And ChatGPT wasn't even based on GPT-4. It was based on a previous generation. It was based on GPT 3.5. It had issues. It had, hallucinations, math errors, etc. But its ability to take on personas and take on roles like a tutor or a teaching assistant or a guidance counselor, it wasn't just emulating. In some ways, it was really taking some of the best practices, especially if it was prompted correctly. And then we started, we were under NDA with OpenAI for about 6 months, and we started figuring out ways to mitigate some of the math errors, the hallucinations, put safety guardrails around it, especially for under 18 users. All the engagements are viewable by their teachers. There's a second AI that moderates the conversation, actively notifies teachers if something's amiss. Khanmigo, which we ended up calling it, won't give answers, but it will act as a writing coach. It will act as a tutor. It's very good at Socratic dialogue. It'll also do things like, it can simulate a literary character to have a conversation with. You can engage in a debate with it. And for professors and teachers, it can help develop lesson plans, help create rubrics. We ended up launching that as part of the GPT-4 launch in March of 2023. As an interesting aside, when ChatGPT came out at the end of November 2022, I slacked Greg Brockman at OpenAI, who's one of the founders, and I said, hey, Greg, we're under NDA. What are you launching? I thought we weren't going to launch anything till March. And he's like, no, we haven't launched anything. All we did is put a chat interface on top of GPT 3.5, which had been out for months. And for some reason, the world, it captured the world's negative and positive imagination. I was worried when that happened. I said, look, this is an imperfect. GPT 3.5 is much worse than GPT-4. And, people are immediately going to anchor on the negative, that it could be used for cheating. It has hallucinations, math errors. And we saw that first wave, especially in K-12, but even a little bit of higher ed, a knee-jerk reaction to say, let's ban this thing. And it wasn't for bad reason, because it can be used to cheat. It can be used to do all of those things. I thought the baby was going to get thrown out with the bathwater. The good news is, after when we released in March, with a much better underlying model and much more safeguards, and actually thinking through the pedagogy of how you do this right, it almost came into an environment where people were asking for something like this. They had kind of gone through the knee jerk on Chat GPT, and then they realized, well, this thing's going to stay, but still, how do we navigate it so kids still do their own work and it's more pedagogically sound? And then when we showed up, they said, oh, this is interesting.
It does seem like the conversation is shifting. Well, I still think we see a lot of concern in higher ed. And again, this is all anecdotal from us based on our reporting and certainly some of the survey I mentioned. But you're right. I think there is this idea like, okay, we've seen some of the concerns, but let's start really getting in, and as you call for, let's have some active participation, because if there's not active participation from educators, then really are going to have the dystopian potential for AI in many ways. I do want to tell you that, I did sign up for Khanmigo, and I had 4 experts test out the AI tutor. Those 4 experts being my kids, who are ages 8 to 12. And we had some fun talking to Khanmigo. To your point, we had to speak from different perspectives. My daughter loves llamas, so she asked to speak like a llama. We found out that llamas poop 5 to 10 pounds a day, which I find fascinating, a little disturbing. And we also asked it to speak as several historical and fictional characters like Katniss Everdeen from the Hunger Games and Alexander Hamilton, because my kids love Hamilton, the musical. And just to be clear with the audience, this was sort of a fun experiment with me and my kids, of course. It was not part of what you do with the Khanmigo when you're in the lessons, where it is sort of, it's not going to let you go off the rails. If you're learning a lesson, it does respond to you in a way where you're like, hey, let's get back on track here. But there were interesting other guardrails that were interesting to me. I mean, you consistently remind folks, and these, again, we're talking about kids outside of higher ed, younger than mostly in higher ed, but consistently say, hey, don't put private information in here. You also, even when you're talking to it as a character, it says, hey, I'm an AI just playing a role here. Don't get confused, which is interesting to me. And we asked it when it was speaking in the voice of Alexander Hamilton, we asked if it, quote unquote, hated Aaron Burr. One of my kids asked that, and actually decided not to go down that route. So I did see some of those guardrails come up. And I guess as you think about it, the guardrails are potentially different for higher education. If you're in a different spot, if you're teaching in the higher education space, what are your general guardrails would you suggest for folks if they want to engage in something like this, personalized tutor using some of the different AIs, generative AIs? What guardrails do you think it has to be out there when you're at the higher ed level specifically?
I think the number one is, in higher ed, we're talking about, for the most part, adults here. I think we can probably release some of the constraints around making everything transparent to the professors, or obviously parents aren't involved in the same way in students' lives at this point. That's probably just a violation of adults' privacy once you start to do that. But I think the main guardrail is to continue to be very transparent and open about what it can and cannot do. And that's where some of the talk about, hey, this is an AI simulation, or hey, look, we're not going to try to speculate on this view. Like, some of our historical characters, our historical characters will only weigh in on things that the historical character had context on. It will not try to wade into a debate today, because we don't know. We really don't know. And there's different ways to interpret it, some of that things. I think the probably the biggest guardrail is making sure that the tool is built to help support, but not help cheat. And it can make that transparent to all of the stakeholders. And so this goes back to, hey, it can act as a writing coach. It can help tutor you. Super important supports that folks, it can even help you get initial feedback. It can even help professors and TAs save time by creating lessons, rubrics, even preliminary grades. But it doesn't go all of the way. That still there's a human in the loop, and they get oversight over what's going on. And that part of that oversight is, if I did make an assignment, if I'm a professor and I made an assignment and students submit it and do it with and submit it through the AI, that I do have transparency on the process, so that I feel comfortable that it didn't happen through Chat GPT.
Those are helpful, Sal. I appreciate that. We had some questions coming from the audience that I want to make sure I get to here. We had one question from an attendee named Karen, who's from the Universities of Shady Grove. And she asked, what is your advice for building and cultivating an environment in which higher education faculty and staff feel empowered to utilize generative AI in their work, and to empower their students to as well? So as you said, the first reaction in some places, what do we ban it? Do we not ban it? Whether in the classroom broadly? I think in Karen's question, she's asking, okay, we're in a place where we want to kind of figure this out. And just that general idea of how do you build and cultivate an environment which higher, again, faculty and staff feel like the potential to kind of have some to experiment with it? How do you kind of build that?
Yeah, I think first step is for folks to just start using these technologies. They should be playing around with Chat GPT. They should be playing around with DALL-E and Stable Diffusion, and start figuring out how it works with images. You're going to have more technologies that are coming that can start doing things, videos and other things. Play with Khanmigo, play with all of these tools as an educator. And actually, the first step is to play with them, and the next step is to actually start to put them into your workflow. Realize that they can help you develop lesson plans, create rubrics, all of these types of things. And Khanmigo especially is built to do those types of things. And then I mentioned that if I were running a writing class like this fall, I would start doing a lot more in class to just make sure that and I actually think that has been, I would have done that actually even a few years ago, because a lot of the kids who really need some of that support. And it allows me as a writing coach to see, as they're developing their writing, what are their real blockers versus, me giving a lecture and then hoping something good happens when they're at home. But I would also ask these students to I would maybe create at least one assignment a term that tells them to use Chat GPT or tells them to use generative AI, because that's also a useful skill. And it can also make them better writers, because to use these technologies effectively, you have to be a strong editor of sorts to put the pieces together. So I think that's another really, Ethan Malik from Wharton School, I think, has really led a lot of the conversation, and he's using it at Wharton for MBA students. So it's a slightly different context than what we're talking about. But I think that, with if you're not using technology that can help you address the cheating issue, more in-class stuff where you're not using generative AI, but to have at least an assignment or two we're saying, go use generative AI. That's your take-home assignment. And I want something pretty ambitious, given that you have these tools now.
Yeah, I appreciate those tips. And I want to move a little bit past this sort of the teaching aspect of it, which is certainly huge, ways to explore it. And you said there's lots of different applications there, and see a little bit bigger picture. I think at a conference at ASU GSV, I heard you talk a little bit about this. So it wasn't really the main focus of the conversation at the time, but you're saying, hey, there's real potential here for the use of AI in different operations of campuses, perhaps to lower the cost of college. Do you have any sense of that? Have you how that could happen, or where do you see that potentially playing out?
Yeah, and I mean, I think this is super important because college is increasingly not accessible, and the ROI for a lot of students is comes into question. I mean, some of the most expensive parts of a college education are, I could imagine, a lot of the grading and feedback. And today, students, it's very resource intensive to grade a paper, and it takes a week, and then you don't normally get multiple shots at gold because it's so resource intensive. So I think there's ways where you can reduce the quote cost of that by 90% while continuing to have humans in the loop, but the AI can do a lot of it. And then also give more fast cycle feedback to students so that they can get better at something like writing. I can imagine, support for students. I talked to a president of a university. I was like, why is the cost going so much faster than inflation? And he's like, well, we have fewer students who are showing up prepared, so we have to provide more support services for them, whether it's usually in math or it's in writing. And once again, I believe generative AI, if it's designed and engineered right, can really support students. And as opposed to having students having to go off, every afternoon to a bespoke tutoring session, it can help answer the questions in the moment. If they heard something in a lecture they don't understand, they can get that question right there answered. If they're doing a problem set in the middle of the night, they can get their question answered. So I think it can help on both of those. I think it can also help with stuff like career coaching, academic coaching. We've been working with some educational psychologists on the AI actually administering some of these interventions that have been shown to improve people's focus or improve their growth mindset and things like that. So I think you're going to see a lot of that.
That's really, fascinating. I think you mentioned, keeping the human in the loop. I think there are then just the concerns, like many people in different industries, and I'm going to raise my hand as a journalist. I've got a little bit of that knee-jerk reaction of like, okay, what's my job as a writer in a few years? I think there are a lot of people in higher ed, when they hear kind of the concerns about the lowering the cost of college means losing the number of people involved in it. And obviously it's an open question. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Again, you said plainly, hey, we're going to keep the human in the loop, but obviously jobs are going to change. drastically, it seems like, for us to prepare for an AI future that's enabled by it.
Yeah, and I don't think anyone's doing anyone a service when a cost of higher education is starting to, 40, 50, $60,000
Sure.
per student per year. Not only is that not sustainable from a student point and a societal point of view, but it's also setting these universities up for failure. Where,
Right.
what you see with a lot of universities, they have these very unsustainable cost structures, and instead of kind of right sizing their cost structures, at some point they just disappear because they just can't. They just, they can't charge the tuition anymore. The funding dries up in some dimension. There's not enough kids majoring in a certain subject, and they haven't had the types of discipline that you might have in the private sector or even the not-for-profit sector. And so I think it's, even though it does mean that, there might be some hard decisions about staffing, at minimum, it should be about expansion of staffing. It could make it less likely that you have to expand staffing, which can already start to address the problem. And then, yeah, there could be situations in which it's not helping anyone if you have a bloated cost structure.
Yeah, I hear you on that. So I don't want to hold you too long. I do want to get to one final question here. The theme of this year's Chronicle Festival is the College of the Future. In 2016, we did an interview with you. We're going to link to that in the chat and get it out to the audience. And sort of, you described that the type of college that you would build at that time. I just kind of wonder, and this is obviously a huge question to end on, but what kind of college would you build today to be ready for this future, which is dramatic, it's changing quickly, it's accelerating in terms of many of these trends? Is there any kind of sense of what kind of college you'd want to see on the horizon?
Oh man, I could spend hours. I could write a book.
I have
I'm
to have you
kind of
back.
writing about book about, but no, like some very high level principles, competency based. It shouldn't be how long you sit in a chair. It should be what you know. I would definitely take a hard look at what you should know. And I don't think it should all be kind of vocational, although I think it is, basic understanding of critical thinking, statistics, reading, writing, law, business, finance. I mean, that should be in there. But of course, I also believe strongly that there should be some core skills that allow you to understand the universe that we're in, and be a participant in democracy and philosophize about the world, but really be able to draw a line from those things to things that will tangibly be useful. I think not making things time-based, once again, competency-based, and then being able to draw clearer lines between that and like real world experience, potentially bring real world experience into, and I know some universities are already doing this, they have very strong co-op systems. I know there's competency based universities already. I would make that much more, make it that much more mainstream. And I think, especially if you include a lot of these co-op universities already, you have students graduating not with debt, but they graduate with savings, and they have they have more experience, so they're that much more ready to enter the workforce. And I'll say it again, because I think some people, when they hear that, think, oh, Sal's just talking about vocational, he doesn't want people to philosophize or talk about the humanities. No, not that at all. But I will say, and that should be part of it. But I know a lot of students who they were able to get a very high-minded education for 4 years, and then they're not able to apply it, and that they are bogged down in debt. They're trying to do jobs. They're not getting the jobs where they can have enough time and space and money so that they can actually apply some of the high-minded skills that they might have been able to practice a little bit in university. And that's the worst situation to be in.
Well, Sal, I really appreciate your thoughts today on AI, as well as larger questions facing higher education right now. Thanks for being at the Chronicle Festival.
Thanks for having me.